December 18th, 1944, 7:31 in the morning. The forests of the Ardennes, near the Belgian crossroads town of St. Vith, were paralyzed by a cold that felt ancient and absolute. It was a cold that froze lubricants in their casings, turned warm breath into instant crystals, and deadened the very sound of the world. Through a fog as thick as cotton wool, the towering pines stood like silent, frost-covered sentinels. For the men of the U.S. Army's 7th Armored Division, this was not a winter wonderland. It was the edge of the abyss. In the valley below, what was left of 3 American rifle companies and a handful of tanks were caught in a tightening German fist. They had fallen back to what they believed was a defensible ridge line. Instead, it was becoming a coffin. This was the 6th day of the massive German counteroffensive the world would come to know as the Battle of the Bulge. It was Hitler's last desperate gamble, and the men freezing in this valley were sitting directly on the house's bet. Inside his M4 Sherman tank, called sign Vindicator, Sergeant David Miller listened to the strained, frantic whispers on the radio. The news was a drumbeat of disaster. The line had broken, units were being bypassed, cut off, annihilated. Then came the order from a battalion commander whose voice was hollowed out by exhaustion and fear. It was an order of pure desperation, a command that admitted defeat. All units, hold your positions at any cost. Conserve armor-piercing ammunition. Do not, I repeat, do not engage heavy armor unless it is a direct threat to your position. Wait for a break in the weather. Air support is our only hope. It was a death sentence. There would be no break in the weather. There would be no air support. There was only the fog, the cold, and the steadily growing sound of grinding steel. Sergeant Miller looked away from the radio, his eyes falling on the ammunition rack. Next to the precious few high-velocity armor-piercing shells, the only thing that stood a sliver of a chance against Germany's new heavy tanks, was a stack of M64 white phosphorus rounds. Smoke shells. Their only authorized purpose was to create a smokescreen, to cover a retreat, to blind the enemy. Using them as a direct-fire offensive weapon was not just against protocol, it was a court-martial offense. To the logisticians in the rear, firing a smoke round at a 70-ton tank was the tactical equivalent of throwing a rock. It was a waste of government property, a useless, forbidden gesture. Through his periscope, a shape began to resolve itself in the fog. It was impossibly large, its form more like a naval destroyer than a tank. A long, lethal 88mm cannon sliced through the mist, followed by a block of angled steel that seemed to absorb the very light around it. It was a Panzerkampfwagen 6 Ausführung B, the King Tiger, a monster, a land battleship that had been hunting them for 2 days. Miller's gunner, Corporal Gallo, whispered the words everyone was thinking. "Sergeant, our AP won't even scratch its front plate. What are your orders?" David Miller watched the German behemoth slowly, arrogantly pivot its turret towards the American line. He could follow the rules. He could conserve his ammunition, hide in his steel box, and wait for the inevitable, fiery end. Or he could gamble on a piece of forbidden knowledge, a memory from a different life, a life before the war. He could bet his career, his freedom, and the lives of his crew on a tactic that didn't exist in any Army field manual. He keyed his intercom, his voice steady, calm, and absolute. "Loader, load Willie Pete." A moment of stunned silence from the crew. "But Sarge," the loader Sam Brody began, "Command said, 'To hell with command. They're not in this can. I am. We're going to cook 'em out.'" That decision made in the frozen heart of the Ardennes, would not be recorded in the official histories. But for the men whose lives hung in balance, it was a choice that would forge a legend, save a company, and prove that sometimes the most brilliant weapon of war isn't the one you were issued, but the one you invent in the crucible of no return.
To understand the radical, almost insane decision made by Sergeant David Miller, you must first understand that he was never supposed to be a soldier. Before the war, he wasn't a leader of men. He wasn't a strategist or a warrior. He was a shift foreman at the Coppers chemical plant just outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. His world wasn't one of ballistics and armor thickness. It was a world of pressure gauges, industrial chemistry, and the sinister, elemental power of raw phosphorus. He grew up in the shadow of steel mills and chemical refineries, a landscape of fire and smoke. He wasn't an engineer or a chemist with a fancy degree, but he possessed something far more valuable on the battlefield: a deep, intuitive, almost alchemical understanding of how chemicals behave under pressure and heat. He knew that white phosphorus, the substance inside those M64 smoke shells, was more than just a smoke-producing agent. He knew it was a nightmare in a can. He had seen what it did when it was exposed to oxygen, how it ignited spontaneously, burning with a ferocious, otherworldly heat of nearly 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. He knew that its smoke wasn't just an obscurant, it was a toxic, corrosive, choking cloud of phosphoric acid. And most importantly, he knew that once it started burning, it was almost impossible to extinguish. It clung to surfaces like a molten parasite, eating through steel, flesh, and bone. This wasn't something he had read in a manual. It was knowledge he had earned through minor industrial accidents and long, dangerous nights at the plant. It was a knowledge the Army had no name for. This quiet man from Pennsylvania was now at the very tip of the spear in the largest and brutalest battle fought by the United States in World War II. The German offensive, codenamed Wacht am Rhein, or Watch on the Rhine, was a surprise attack of stunning force. Over 200,000 German troops and nearly 1,000 tanks and armored vehicles had smashed through the thinly held American lines in the Ardennes. Hitler's objective was audacious: to split the Allied armies in two and capture the vital port of Antwerp, Belgium, forcing the Western Allies to sue for peace. And leading the northern shoulder of this assault was the most feared unit in the German Waffen-SS, the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. Within it, the spearhead was a brutal, efficient armored battle group known as Kampfgruppe Piper, named for its commander, the infamous Joachim Piper. Piper's unit was equipped with the best, most terrifying machines Germany could produce, including the 70-ton King Tiger. The King Tiger, with its virtually impenetrable frontal armor and its long-range, high-velocity 88mm gun, outclassed every Allied tank on the battlefield. To the American GIs, it was more than a machine, it was a psychological weapon. It was mobile, fire-breathing proof of their own mortality. Sergeant Miller's Sherman, the Vindicator, was a world away from the King Tiger. It was a reliable, mass-produced workhorse, but its 75mm gun was a pea shooter against the Tiger's front slope. Inside that Sherman with Miller was a family forged by the pressures of combat. Corporal Frankie Gallo, the gunner from Chicago, was a former Golden Gloves boxer who moved with a quiet, deadly economy of motion. Private First Class Sam Broey, the loader from Iowa, was a lanky 19-year-old farm who could handle the heavy shells with the speed and grace of a man who had spent his life bucking hay. In the driver's seat was technician fifth-grade Charlie Egan, a motor-mouthed mechanic from Detroit who treated the Sherman's engine like a living thing. And huddled in the co-driver's seat was the newest member, Private Mike Russo from Boston, a quiet, religious kid who still flinched at the sound of incoming fire. 5 men in a thin-skinned steel box facing a Leviathan. The situation, already desperate, was rapidly collapsing. A crackle on the radio brought the news they had all been dreading. Another Sherman from their platoon, positioned about 200 yards to their left, had spotted the Tiger. "Tally-ho! Tiger in the open, traversing!" The voice was young, strained. Then another transmission, tight with adrenaline, "On the way!" Through his own periscope, he saw the muzzle flash from the other Sherman. He saw the tracer round arc through the fog and strike the King Tiger's turret. He didn't hear a clang of penetration. He heard a sharp, metallic tink, the sound of a pebble hitting a fortress wall. Then came the reply. The King Tiger didn't seem to rush. It moved with the cold, arrogant lethargy of a predator that knows its prey is already dead. The massive 88mm cannon swiveled, let out a deafening whip-crack of sound, and the other Sherman simply ceased to exist. It didn't just explode, it vaporized in a flash of white-hot light and black boiling smoke. The radio went silent. That was it. There was no one else. Battalion was out of reach. Command's plan of holding and waiting for air support had just been incinerated. The fog was their tomb, and the King Tiger was the undertaker. Time had run out. And in that moment, the chemical plant foreman from Pittsburgh took over the soldier. The Army's rules were for a world that no longer existed. All that existed now was the Tiger, his crew, and the forbidden knowledge burning in his mind.
The other tank crews saw a 70-ton monster. Sergeant David Miller saw a machine with weaknesses. He saw a complex system of optics, ventilation, and human beings all encased in a steel shell. His aha moment wasn't a flash of tactical brilliance in the traditional sense. It was a cold, calculated diagnosis from his life before the war. He knew he couldn't kill the beast with a frontal assault. His AP rounds were useless. But he didn't have to kill it. He just had to make the crew inside believe they were about to be roasted alive. He wasn't targeting the armor. He was targeting their minds. He was fighting the men, not the machine. "Charlie," Miller said over the intercom, his voice a mask of calm. "When I give the word, I want you to give me a short burst forward, just enough to rock us, then back into cover. Got it?" "You got it, Sarge," Egan replied, his hands white-knuckling the controls. "Frankie," Miller continued, turning his attention to his gunner, "forget the hull, forget the turret. You see the commander's cupola, the little slits for the periscopes? I see 'em, Sarge, but they're tiny. That's the point. Don't aim to penetrate, aim to blind. On my mark." Miller took a deep breath. He could feel the thrum of the Sherman's engine vibrating through the floor plates. He watched the Tiger, now stationary, its crew likely scanning the fog for their next victim, confident in their invincibility. "Now, Charlie, now!" The Sherman lurched forward out of the tree line. For a terrifying second, they were exposed. "Fire, Frankie! Fire!" The 75mm cannon bucked, but instead of the sharp crack of an AP round, there was a dull, hollow thump. The M64 white phosphorus shell soared through the air, a lazy, wobbling arc, and burst directly on top of the King Tiger's turret. There was no massive explosion. Instead, the turret was suddenly showered with hundreds of burning, white-hot particles, each one a miniature sun adhering to the steel. A thick, billowing cloud of acrid white smoke instantly enveloped the top of the tank. "Smoke! Smoke! Driver, move!" the German commander yelled on his own intercom. But before the tank could move, another thump echoed from the fog. This time, Miller had anticipated their reaction. "Engine deck, Frankie! Lay it on the back porch!"
The second WP shell burst over the rear of the Tiger, directly on the large grills of the engine's air intakes. Now, the real horror began for the German crew. The tank's powerful Maybach engine, starved for air, began to suck the thick, chemical-laden smoke directly into the ventilation system and the crew compartment. This wasn't wood smoke. It was a weaponized chemical irritant. The air became thick with microscopic acidic particles that seared the lungs and burned the eyes. The crew began to choke, their vision blurring, their breaths coming in ragged, panicked gasps. Was this a new Allied weapon? An artillery barrage of some unknown chemical agent? They were sealed inside a 70-ton gas chamber, blind, choking, and terrified. The German commander, his eyes streaming, screamed into his own intercom, "Bail out! Bail out! The tank is on fire!" He had no way of knowing that the armor was perfectly intact, but the phosphorus, burning with relentless fury on the engine deck, was creating the perfect illusion of a catastrophic hit. The psychological impact was complete. Miller and his crew watched, their hearts pounding. Through a gap in the trees, they saw a side hatch on the King Tiger fly open. One, then two figures, clad in black Panzer uniforms, tumbled out, desperately beating on small, smoldering spots on their clothes. They scrambled into the woods and vanished. But the tank wasn't dead yet. The driver was still inside. The Tiger began to move, blindly, erratically, trying to escape the choking cloud. And in its panic, it made a fatal mistake. The driver swung the tank hard to the left, trying to turn around, and in doing so, he exposed its thinner side armor to the waiting Sherman. It was the moment Miller had been gambling on. "He's showing us his flank, Frankie! AP! Load AP now!" Miller roared. Sam Brody, working on pure adrenaline, slammed an armor-piercing round into the breech. "Load it! Fire!" The AP round screamed across the frozen landscape. This time, there was no gentle tink. There was a tremendous, violent crash of metal on metal. The shell, hitting the less protected side armor over the ammunition storage, punched straight through. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, a bright orange flame licked out of the entry hole, followed by a devastating internal explosion that blew the massive turret clean off its ring and sent it tumbling into the snow. The ghost of the Ardennes had been slain. Days later, when American forces finally secured the sector, they found the hulking, decapitated wreck of the King Tiger. Engineers who examined the kill were baffled. The final, fatal shot was clear. But what had caused the initial panic? Why had half the crew abandoned a perfectly functional, undamaged tank? Captured German tankers from the 1st SS Panzer told interrogators of a terrifying new American tactic. They spoke of a ghost battery hidden in the fog, firing wave after wave of a new incendiary artillery that could burn through steel and choke a crew in seconds. They never knew they had been defeated by a single, audacious Sherman crew from Pittsburgh, who had used nothing more than 5 men, a deep understanding of chemistry, and the courage to break every rule in the book. The legend of the cooking shells had been born.
The immediate aftermath of the engagement was not one of celebration, but of stunned survival. As Vindicator carefully pulled back to the newly established rally point, a mud-splattered infantry captain, a man whose company had been directly in the Tiger's path, jogged over to Miller's tank, waving him down. He looked up at Miller, who was peering out of the commander's hatch, his face smeared with grime and exhaustion. "You in charge of this tank?" the captain asked, his voice hoarse. Miller nodded. "Sergeant David Miller." The captain stared at him for a long moment, then at the smoldering wreck in the distance. "I don't know what the hell that was," he said, shaking his head. "I've never seen anything like it. But you just stopped a full-blown breakthrough. You bought us time we didn't have. My men were alive because of whatever you just did." He didn't offer a salute. He offered something more meaningful. A simple, profound nod of respect from one survivor to another. It was the first and perhaps the most important validation Miller would receive. The official validation, however, was a different matter entirely. 2 days later, well behind the front lines, Miller was summoned to a makeshift command post in a drafty Belgian farmhouse. Waiting for him was a major from divisional headquarters, a man whose uniform was suspiciously clean and whose face was pinched with the institutional anger of a career officer who sees the world only through the lens of a rule book. On a crate between them lay Miller's after-action report. "Sergeant," the major began, his voice dripping with condescension, "your report states that you expended 6 rounds of M64 white phosphorus ammunition in a direct-fire offensive capacity against an enemy heavy tank. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir," Miller replied, standing at attention. The major tapped a field manual with a manicured finger. "You are aware, I presume, that this is a direct violation of standing engagement protocols. These rounds are for screening and signaling purposes only. You wasted valuable, specialized ordnance, Sergeant." The accusation hung in the frigid air. Miller didn't flinch. His defense wasn't an excuse, it was a simple, irrefutable statement of battlefield reality. "Major, my standard-issue AP rounds were bouncing off its front plate. The men who wrote those protocols weren't in that forest with that king tiger. My choices were to follow a rule that didn't apply or to sit there and let my crew and that entire rifle company be systematically slaughtered. I made my choice." The major's face hardened. He was about to deliver a career-ending tirade when a new voice cut through the tension. "That's enough, Major." Leaning against the farmhouse door was a battle-weary colonel, the regimental commander. He had been listening the entire time, his face a roadmap of sleepless nights and hard-won battles. He walked slowly into the room and picked up Miller's report. He looked at the major. "You're right, the sergeant violated protocol." Then he turned his tired, piercing eyes on Miller. "Sergeant, you disobeyed a direct order. You expended ammunition in an unauthorized manner. You also single-handedly destroyed a king tiger that had already annihilated 2 of our tanks and was in the process of rolling up the entire flank of this division. You held the line. Get back to your tank. Dismissed." The major stood, speechless. The charges were never filed. The incident was quietly buried in the mountains of paperwork generated by the chaos of the Bulge. Weeks later, long after the snows had begun to melt, David Miller was awarded the Bronze Star Medal. The official citation made no mention of the king tiger or the white phosphorus. It was a generic commendation for heroic and meritorious service during the Ardennes campaign. There was no parade, no ceremony. A clerk handed him the small box with the medal inside while he was signing for fuel and rations. It was a humble reward for an unsung act of genius, a quiet acknowledgement from an army that could never publicly admit that sometimes the men in the field knew better than the men writing the manuals.
The true legacy of an action is not found in a medal, but in its ripple effect. Sergeant David Miller's unorthodox tactic, born of desperation and chemical knowledge, did not go unnoticed. While his specific report was buried, the broader lessons were not. In the brutal postmortems of the Battle of the Bulge, where American armor had suffered horrendous losses to superior German tanks, a pattern emerged. Analysts studying after-action reports noted multiple instances where heavy tanks like the Panther and King Tiger were neutralized not by penetrating hits, but by mission kills, disabled, blinded, or abandoned by their crews. Quietly, without fanfare, the official doctrine began to change. New training manuals issued in late 1945 and used into the Korean War began to include sections on what the Army called target obscuration and neutralization. It was a dry, bureaucratic term for what David Miller had discovered instinctively in the heat of battle. The manuals taught tankers that if you can't kill a tank, you blind it. If you can't penetrate its armor, you attack its optics, its ventilation, its crew. The once forbidden tactic of using smoke and white phosphorus as a direct-fire weapon against heavy armor became a recognized, if unwritten, last-ditch strategy. The Army had quietly integrated the lesson from the Ghost of St. Vith. Miller's genius was now doctrine. The validation also lived on in the words of the men who were there. Decades after the war, a letter was found in the archives of the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center. It was from a Private First Class Harold Jensen, a rifleman in the company that Miller's action had saved. Writing to his brother in February of 1945, he described that day. "We saw the tiger come out of the woods. We all thought we were dead. It was over. Then this one Sherman, hidden in the trees, started shooting smoke at it. The damnedest thing I ever saw. It wasn't trying to blow it up. It was just covering it in this awful burning smoke. The Krauts bailed out like the devil himself was inside. Whoever that tank commander was, he was either the bravest man I ever met or the craziest. I don't know his name, but I know this. I owe him my life." After the war, David Miller returned to Pittsburgh. He went back to the Koppers plant, married his sweetheart, raised 2 children, and lived a quiet, unassuming life. He rarely spoke of the war. To his neighbors, he was just Dave Miller, the quiet man who worked the evening shift. He was not a hero who had single-handedly faced down a legend. He had seen enough fire and smoke to last a lifetime. The ghost of the Ardennes was laid to rest in the quiet humility of his post-war life. But the memory remained. In the late 1970s, his son, then in college, was studying military history and asked his father about his experiences. For one of the first times, David Miller opened up. He later wrote his son a letter, trying to explain the choice he had made that frozen December morning. The letter, a deeply personal artifact, contains the emotional climax of his entire story. He wrote, "They teach you in the Army to shoot at the tank. They give you charts showing armor thickness and weak points. But on that day, I wasn't thinking about the charts. I was thinking about my first week at the plant when a phosphorus vat overflowed. I remembered the panic. I remembered the smoke. It's never the machine that breaks first, son. It's the man running it. So I didn't shoot at the tank. I shot at the men inside. I didn't need to break their steel. I just needed to break their courage. I just wanted to make them more scared of being in there than they were of getting out. And I guess I did." In the brutal, unforgiving calculus of war, genius is not always about having the bigger gun. Sometimes it's about knowing how to make the man holding it wish he was somewhere else.